All clear.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Museo's Open Book Authors online presentation. I'm Carol Latham, the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Museo, Museum, and Cultural Center in Anaheim. And it is our wish that you, your family, and circle of concern are all safe and healthy, not only now, but that you stay that way. During this afternoon's presentation, we will share web links for each author for additional information and for book sales. Please enter your questions in the chat and we'll get as many of them answered as we can after the presentation. And as a reminder, this presentation is recorded on Facebook Live. It is my pleasure to introduce Maddie Margarita of LitUP OC. Maddie is a writer and host of LitUP OC, a popular writer's salon in Tustin, California. And on her podcast, Author on the Air Network is where she's featured. She's on the board of Sisters in Crime and the Southern California Writers Association. So I invite you to get comfy and enjoy this afternoon's presentation with Maddie Margarita.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Carol. I am indeed Maddie Margarita. And on behalf of LitUP Orange County and our panel today, I'd like to thank you for inviting us into the special virtual world of the Museo. I can't think of a better way to spend a Sunday afternoon than talking books and writing on the edge, which is our topic today with Rufi Thorpe, Ava Pochoda, and Ava Homa. We have an exceptional panel today, and I think it's going to be a wonderful discussion. So rather than me talk, I'm going to let everybody else talk. We're going to let everybody introduce themselves and just start by talking a little bit about your book so that we give people a sense of your writing and your story. So I don't know, Rufi, do you want to start?
Okay. So my novel is The Knockout Queen, and it's a little bit hard to logline because the very first plot point and the premise sort of is a spoiler. So instead, I'll just tell you about the characters. It's basically about two best friends. Bunny, by the end of high school, is 6'3" and 200 pounds with the face of a boy angel and the abs of a Ninja Turtle. And her dad is like the star real estate agent of the town. And she's sort of popular, kind of. And then her next door neighbor is a boy named Michael who moved to her town after his mom was sent to prison for stabbing his dad and is living with his aunt and works at Rite Aid after school and is just really much more academically minded and smart, and also has a secret Grindr account and sort of is not being, he's definitely still in the closet, kind of. And so you wouldn't think that those two characters have very much in common, but they find that they have everything in common.
All right. And Rufi, this is your fourth?
Yes, this is my third.
Okay. All right, great. And the first one was
The Girls from Corona Del Mar.
Right, Dear Fang, right?
And then Dear Fang, yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. Ivy, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Ava Pochoda. I'm so excited to virtually be here. I love participating in Orange County literary events. There are so many great readers down there. I can't tell you how many events I've done in the OC since I moved to California, and I've met and made so many friends there, and it's really great to be here. I really wish I could be there in person, but I'm sure that will happen. So thanks so much for having me. As I said, my name is Ava Pochoda, and my most recent book is called These Women. And it is a novel set in West Adams in Los Angeles, where I live, which is a neighborhood in the middle of the city. And it follows 6 women who are all living the specter of violence as a result of a serial killer who's hunting women in South LA. It's loosely based on the Grim Sleeper case, but the details are uniquely my own. My intention in writing this book was to remove the serial killer from the story and to really, as I say, punch a serial killer-sized hole in a narrative and focus instead on the victims. This is a book for the women who have survived, who've been brutalized. It's to give women, particularly minority women, voices and to sort of reclaim the narrative of crime fiction for victims as opposed to the perpetrators of the crime.
Great, thank you. All right, Ava Homa.
Hi, hello
Hi.
everyone. I want to start by thanking Carol, Maddie, Rakinda, and everyone else who has organized this event. It's exciting to be talking to such wonderful writers, as Ivy said, a lot of great writers and readers in OC. This is my debut novel, Daughters of Smoke and Fire. It came out in May 2020. Before this, I had a collection of short stories called Echoes from the Other Land, which was published in Toronto in 2010. This one, Daughters of Smoke and Fire, it basically has two different publishers in US, Canada, and UK. This is the US version. This is the Canadian version by HarperCollins. This is set in the Kurdish region of Iran. This is the story of a sibling, basically, Layla, is very much interested in arts and in filmmaking specifically, but she has a lot of obstacles piling up. Her brother, Chia, is more interested in being a lawyer, especially becoming a human rights lawyer. He's passionate about justice, and his biggest dream is to one day bring the perpetrators of genocide, Kurdish genocide, to the International Criminal Court. But one day he's participating in a protest in Tehran and he disappears. So now it's Layla's turn to decide and figure out where he is, whether or not he's alive, what to do next. And while doing that, she also puts her own life in danger.
Okay, that's good. All right. So now that we have a sense of kind of what everybody's book is about, I mean, having read most of them all the way through, I get a sense that that each of you has a personal stake in the story and the message. So I was just wondering, and I'm going to throw it out there, is that in fact the case? And why, if it is, why this story? What was it about the story that you created that drew you to write this book? We could start with anybody. Rufi, Ivy.
Well, this book started over 10 years ago when I was like in college. I went to a party in Brooklyn and there was a girl boxer there. And I think some of it was traumatic brain injury and some of it, maybe she was on drugs, but she was really out of it. And at one point kind of got stuck in the bathroom and couldn't get out. And she had this boyfriend who was her kind of caretaker, but who didn't seem like a great guy. And I just was haunted. I didn't even have a conversation with this woman, but I just kept thinking about her for years, so much so that then I wrote a novel called Bunny Lampert before The Girls from Cornet Del Mar that was never published. It was really more a connection of interconnected short stories in which she was a peripheral character. And so then for me, the book started with Bunny with this sort of fantasy of having that level of physical power. And I think that I also was influenced. One of my good friends worked at a domestic abuse hotline, and the narrative that she saw kind of over and over again was women staying in abusive relationships, and then when they attempt to defend themselves in a fight or they hit back, or then having sort of the book thrown at them. Because when women are violent, it's seen as being sort of aberrant or unnatural. Whereas if a man like hits somebody, it's a very natural instinct that they shouldn't have given into. And so I just really wanted to talk about female violence and like the empowering ways and the terrifying moral responsibility of being able to hurt people like that.
Bunny was a great character, and I love the name. And all your characters are so relatable, but we'll talk about character in a little bit. Ava, how about you? I mean, obviously this book has a very personal connection. You have a personal connection to the cause and the situation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I wanted to write the story of the Kurds because so very little, almost nothing has been written about the Kurds. And that's one of the million prices that you pay for being stateless. When you don't have a country, when you don't even exist on the map, you don't exist anywhere, not even in academia. So my question has been, how do you deal with realities of life when you're put in that situation? When you are a woman, a minority woman, you live under the dictatorship of a country like Iran, which is where I was born and raised. And in addition to that, because I have worked as a journalist, an activist for so many years, I have been so involved in what happens in prisons, to political prisoners, to their families when a political prisoner is executed. And so the question has always been for me, when we are aware of the atrocities and what human being is capable of doing to other human beings, why do we even keep living? You know, what's in there, and how can we keep pushing? How can we not get, how do we basically deal with injustice? Because it's the easiest way to look the other way, to just ignore it. It's very overwhelming to look injustice in the eye and not be overwhelmed with it. So I was basically trying to see in general, on a universal level, what gives humans resilience and the ability to keep pushing. And then I decided to set the book in the Kurdish region of Iran, specifically to talk about the life of minority women in Iran, but also when they get out and they live as migrants on the margins of Western society, how much do they gain and how much do they lose? And so basically just an homage to human capabilities and resilience.
Wow. These are all huge topics. Ivy, how about you?
Yeah. It was really interesting to hear both Ava and Rufi answer that question, because there's like elements of things that I'm dealing with in my book that you both talk about. I also have a female boxer in my book, and I have someone who uses boxing as a way to like express the violence that she's experienced and the violence within her. I'm very interested in violence overall. Obviously, that's probably a huge theme in Ava's book. The pandemic being what it is, I have not had time to read a lot of books. I do very interested in reading both of these. I'm also really interested on women in the margins, and how violence against women is often taken for granted, especially in crime fiction, how we so easily accept that, but never spend any time understanding the victims of the violence. We just skate right over that. I wrote my book because I watched a documentary about a serial killer for completely different reasons, not because I was at all interested in the case, but I wanted to see how a particular person spoke. And I knew that a person like this was in the documentary. In the course of watching it, I realized that a serial killer's victims are not just the people he leaves behind, dead, the bodies, but all the people who have existed in the specter of, in his presence, and my inspiration was to give voice to those women, and also to sort of, once I started writing it, I realized that like for the most part, serial killers' victims are marginalized, especially serial killers who go uncaught for a very long time because no one bothers to look for the killer of marginalized women. But I realized that the victimization that those women experience is just a darker shade of victimization of women in general, and women investigating the case, mothers of victims, So this book was to sort of create a link between, different women's experiences, from a professional woman to sort of a streetwalker, to say that like this victimization and violence, it doesn't just necessarily begin and end with a dead body left on the street, but is this sort of cultural systemic thing that we've sort of normalized and that we're okay with. So it's funny. I'm so glad to be in this conversation, because I was listening to both those answers. I was like, oh my gosh, it's like, take those two ideas and there's my book.
See, you all wondered why the chemistry, why I thought the chemistry of this panel would be great. And this is one of the reasons. And I think, Ivy, you brought up the concept of voice. And, as a writer, I listened to all of your goals setting out, but and which are all lofty to begin with, but then the execution of that is just, it could be mind blowing. So when you're developing characters and telling a story, that of the magnitude that the three of you are doing, voice is such an important aspect of the story. How do you go about deciding what that voice will be? And of all the characters in your story, who will be the person, or people in Ivy's case, telling the story? Does anybody want to jump in there first, or? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll go. Sorry to jump in there. It's so tricky. Well, I mean, I have two different answers to that question. First of all, I think to tell the story of a crime, it's really important to see it from different aspects. So like the way I experience my neighborhood in West Adams is very different from my next door neighbor, who is an 80-year-old Filipino woman whose entire family used to live on the block in different houses. So if a crime was committed on the block, you know, or anything would have happened, the way we experience it and interpret it is different. So in order to create a really great three-dimensional panorama of any story, I always rely on a host of voices, anywhere from 4 to 6. It might not always be the case, but I don't think there's any one true narrative. So to have different voices in there for me is a truer representation. I also write about places where I live, but can be an outsider in. So I think it's very important to have my outsider status as one of the voices, and as well, and also have people who have different experiences of, you know, a specific area. I love voice. I love people's voices. I love to eavesdrop on conversations and listen to people on the street. It's a really bad habit. And I just think that the musicality of the way people talk is sort of what inspires my writing. So, you know, my story, I wanted it to span all people who had experienced, you know, this horrible, you know, tragedy of a man killing women. And it just seemed that in order to tell that story, you had to have, you know, a woman who was a prostitute, or sort of, and then you had to have a, you know, a mother of a victim, a police officer, although that was tricky for me. And it just sort of evolved from there. But the thing that was most important was really capturing the way each of these women talked. And that was my favorite part, because when I got it, it just became so much fun to write. Because, you know, I think that we tend to disregard some people for their speech patterns. And I think that within, you know, certain speech patterns is real poetry and really like great storytelling. So yeah, that was the most fun, was the voices.
Okay. How about you, Rufi? Both Bunny and Michael have great voice, and there's humor and sadness and tragedy and all those things in there, and in their interactions. I know you talked about Bunny, but how did you hear her voice, and how did you hear Michael's voice?
Well, so as I said, I started the book with Bunny, and I tried writing it from her point of view, and it just didn't work at all. She couldn't really articulate what was happening to her. She was just experiencing everything as pain, and she wasn't able to teach the reader how to fall in love with her because she was too conflicted about her own self. And so I knew I needed a focalizer character, because she was also a little bit literally larger than life. And, you know, you can't have Jay Gatsby tell The Great Gatsby. You can't have Sophie tell Sophie's Choice. And so I knew that I needed a focalizer character, and really thinking of Michael was just as dumb as, like, I looked out the window and was like, what if she had a neighbor? And so from there, though, I love voice, and I love mimicry and doing people's voices. Both my parents were actors. Maybe that has something to do with it. I'm super just interested in people's physical mannerisms and their tics, and the way that they handle themselves in a conversation. So for me, the exploratory writing for trying to find a character's voice is really just a lot of failing and trying things out. And then you'll have a moment where you're like, oh, like that. And Michael's voice, who's the narrator of the book, is just, he's so wonderfully mean. Once I understood that, like, what he brought to it was this willingness to actually say what was going on and to really nail the characters to the wall, then it was just fun. It was like off to the races.
They were so relatable. It was like you were eavesdropping, you know, on a conversation that you really kept moving your chair closer to because you couldn't believe what you were hearing. So yeah, good job on that. Now, Ava, how about you with the story? I know the story that you were telling, and you had two strong personalities in there. You could have told that either Chia's story or Layla's story. How did you decide to tell it from her point of view? And she saw such and experienced such terrible things. How did you go about putting together her voice? And how did you hear that in your head? So you were able to tell that story from her POV.
Right. So like Rufi and Ivy, I'm also very interested in how people phrase their ideas, how they go about expressing themselves, their body language and this and that. I was also looking at the general ways that people would deal with, like I said, injustice in the world. So I thought about creating these four members of the family, the mother, father, Chia, and Layla, and thought about different ways that they would deal with the realities of their existence in this world. So I wanted the mom to be someone who just looks the other way, is more interested in sexual adventure, in sleeping with, an intersex person with a variety of, people. And at the same time, I had the father who experienced genocide firsthand. He witnessed when his uncles and grandfather were massacred. And he was in prison and he was tortured, and how that killed a core inside him and made a shell of a human out of him that can't love, can't connect, can't really be a father. He is there, he's present, but he's really absent. And then I had Layla and Chia, and I ended up giving a section to Chia to talk about his own experience, and ended up giving a section to Alan. So I now have these three voices, even though Layla is the one who starts and ends the story. And I agree. It takes a lot of listening to their voice, figuring out who they are. I have this habit of writing thousands of words, just trying to get to know my characters deeper. And I want to see what kind of relationship they have with themselves. So obviously, Layla, Chia, and her parents not only have a different relationship with the outside world, but also with themselves and how they perceive themselves. Even though from an external perspective, Layla is a Kurdish woman, her mother is a Kurdish woman, but the way they see themselves, the way they perceive their role is completely different. Therefore, that changes also their external realities. So I've created this long checklist for myself when I ask myself, what does my character sound like or smell like? And how do they feel about who they are? How do they perceive themselves in society? Who do they pretend to be? Who would they rather be? And who do they imagine they could be? And things like that. And that could be one of the reasons it takes me so many years to complete a book.
Well, yeah. And not only that, I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about how many languages do you speak?
I am fluent in 3 languages and speak 2 more, so 5.
Do you include Canadian as one of those languages separate from English, or no?
No, it's just English.
So, I mean, I've read your work and we've talked, and I know your work, and you write such beautiful literary fiction in English. How does that happen? Do you think do you think predominantly in Farsi, or do you think and then translate, or do you think in English, or how does that work?
Right. So it took a lot of work and many years. I no longer translate. When I speak in Kurdish, I only think in Kurdish. When I speak in English, I only think in English. But that took years and years of, Kurdish is my mother tongue. It was also a language that I was denied growing up. I couldn't learn in my mother tongue. So I learned Persian, and I got really better at Persian than I got in my mother tongue. And then I wanted to, as an act of decolonization, to now learn a 3rd language and master that one, and then also come back and learn my own mother tongue. But when you have so much passion for language and literature, it's something that is more joy than work. So I know there is always these assumptions that you can't really create literary work in your 3rd language. And I was told that, and I believed it for many years, but it turned out to be a lie. I think when you set your heart on something, and if you're truly passionate about something, you will end up, and if you're a storyteller, I mean, I was always a writer, always a storyteller. So a matter of mastering another language also gives you this beautiful aesthetic distance with the subject, also psychological distance with the subject. I'm sure if I were to write the exact same story in Kurdish, it would be a completely different story. So it's fascinating to explore all these things.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay. And, you know, we were talking a little bit about the subjects of the stories of the books. And I wondered if any of you felt an element of risk taking this on. I mean, obviously, I can understand what Ava's risk would be in a lot of cases, but Rufi, how about you? I mean, I think The Knockout Queen was very different from your other books, although they had similarities. But did you feel an element of risk or responsibility taking on some of this topic?
Well, there's always the fear that you're going to get it wrong. But I think the only way you get it written is to believe that if you work hard enough, you can get it right. I think there's sort of two things. The personal risk that I felt as I was writing it was a lot more because Michael is in some ways the most autobiographical character that I have ever written. And he kind of kept bringing up these like sequences from my own life and trying to insert them in. And I'd be like, no, why is he like, I really didn't want to talk about how sex and violence are connected. I started the book thinking I was talking about violence and particularly female violence. And then I understood I was also talking about sex and shame and bodies and being an animal, and the whole thing sort of became connected. And so I think for me personally, the risk that I felt was a lot about like facing sort of aspects of my own life as I was writing it and trying to figure out how honest I wanted to be even with myself. And I think that in terms of trying to get it right, I think that I have like a blessed blitheness where I just assume that I can do it and then try. And I think that there is this, I have a very super melodramatic imagination. My tendency for characters, I love like eccentric and odd characters. And so I think all my novels have a little bit this hyper real or slightly surreal quality. And that's just, I'm helpless about.
Ivy, how about you?
Well, I guess there were several different levels of risk that I took. You know, on the most superficial level, I'm always called a crime writer, though, you know, I think the jury's out on that one. And this was definitely a novel that was more squarely about, you know, a crime. And I felt a lot of obligation to the conventions of the genre that I didn't want to abide by. So that felt like a risk to like throw my hat fully in that ring, but then not play by the rules. And then another risk that seemed to be quite prevalent was, you know, the material ain't easy. You know, it's like, I have no problem reading from the book, but like a lot of this stuff is pretty violent. It's perfectly earned. It's, you know, it's sexual violence, though we don't see sexual violence. It's a way of talking. I was really worried that people, I mean, I wrote in my previous novel, Wonder Valley, they kill a chicken on a farm and a chicken farm, and people like losing their minds about how gross and violent it was. I was like, where do you think your chicken comes from? Like, they kill it. It's not disgusting. Like, I have killed a chicken. It's, you know, maybe not my favorite thing to do in the afternoon, but like, get over it. Like, haven't you watched TV? Like, this is a chicken. So I was like, now this is really bad. Like, these women are being brutalized and you don't see it, but you do hear about it. And I was really worried about the nature of the way some of the prostitutes were going to talk, because that's how they talk. It's very funny in my mind, but it's graphic and explicit, and they're, you know. And then, of course, the biggest risk, which is the one that I'm a little nervous to wade into because I've sort of skirted around it, but you did ask, is I do write characters who are not of my race or class, so that's always a huge risk. And especially now, rightfully so. You know, I've done it in all of my books. I really felt to tell this story that it would do a grave injustice to, you know, just the whole point is to share a panoply of voices who have been, you know, associated with this type of violence. And of course, many of those people are minorities. All I can say about that is it's scary, but as long as you honor the story you're telling and do not be graphic or manipulative or degrading, it seems to be have worked out. I teach in Skid Row. I've worked in Skid Row for 7 years. A lot of the people I work with are, not a lot, but a great number have worked in the sex profession, and I do spend time with them. So I use a lot of their stories or their examples. And the musicality of the way some of these women talk. So that probably is the biggest overall risk. It didn't feel risky when I was doing it, but then when the book comes out, you're like, this is a little worrisome, but that's the point of being a writer. You should write a little bit, as you say, on the edge. Isn't that the name of this conversation?
And thank you so much for answering the question I didn't know how to ask. So I appreciate that. Okay, so also because the characters that are the main characters in the books are outside of the reality of most of the people who will be reading them. Did you worry about having to make them relatable or likable?
Me?
Let's start with Rufi, and then we'll go back to you, Ivy, and then to Ava. I mean, you had great characters in there. Did you worry about making them reliable?
It never even occurred to me that anyone could not love them. I found them so lovable. And so then it's whenever I get people who are like, I just couldn't relate to them. I'm like, well, what is wrong with you? I don't know. So I think that the secret is falling in love with them yourself. And if you can show them to the reader in all their splendor, and their complicatedness and their vulnerability, and you just hope that it's enough. I mean, we're all assholes. Like, human beings are terrible. So I don't know.
That's the one thing everybody's going to remember about today. So thank you for that. That's the soundbite. Yeah. Thanks for the soundbite. But how about I think that they are relatable, but how about the likability factor? Did you worry at all about the likability factor? Because some of the things that happen in the book are, again, outside of most people's normal experience. Did you worry about the likability factor at all?
I was aware of navigating that to some extent. I think part of the reason that I made Michael a boy instead of like a young woman exploring her sexuality was in part because I didn't want any kind of romantic relationship between him and Bunny. I wanted it very separate. But also because if he'd been a girl, there would have been all this like, oh, he's being so slutty and all this baggage. And I didn't want that. And so I think that I know I made decisions aware of it. But I guess I think that there is this concept of a likable character. I don't think characters have to be likable. I think they have to be interesting. Sometimes a character can be so unlikable, but they're unlikable in a way that is boring. And that's when we're turned off. We all want to watch Iago. It's not that we want to be best friends with these people. It's that we want to watch what they're going to do next. And so I always think it's better to shoot for interesting than likable.
I was reading a lot of your reviews on Amazon, and so many of them got sucked into the book and were so surprised at what they actually ended up reading and how they ended up loving it was great. So I'm glad that you answered that question. So Ava, how about you? I mean, the story matter is very serious. And some of the scenes in it are very graphic. Did you worry about people being able to get through that, through the lens of Layla?
So, I mean, I knew that when I write about people that most of my audience in North America haven't heard of, then I, by default, I don't make myself highly popular because, yes, we do deal with racism on one hand. On the other hand, there is this affinity bias that we are all more inclined to reading to what looks more like us, right? So I knew by virtue of my identity and also my topic, it's easy for others to overlook me. But that's a choice that I made consciously because I believe we live in a world where a lot of us are realizing that if we read each other more, there will be less war, there will be less injustice. We all benefit from it, collective humanity. So I wrote specifically for people who are willing to open their hearts to other people and see what their stories is like. To get to be a Kurdish woman for the 10 hours, however many hours it takes to read a novel, and experience that. And I was also aware that I was offering the benefit of traveling to parts of the world that you can't really access except through books, right? So I knew that I'm offering something that's fresh, original, authentic, but at the same time, it's not a book that will people easily pick it up. It's not something that is interesting off the bat. As for the realities of Kurdish lives, yes, it's difficult, but there's also so much joy and beauty in this culture. There's wonderful dance that comes with history and is part of every ceremony. It tells a story. The dance, a collective dance, tells a story in itself. The food that is in there, the music, just the loving nature of a collective culture when so many people out there watch out for you, even though they won't necessarily see you. So there is a balance, I think, in my opinion, that what I try to do between hope and frustration, between pain and resilience and all of that. And I think that speaks to the human truth. Like, I know on surface things are different, but it's always difficult to be a human being to start with. It's more difficult if you're a woman, it's more difficult if you're stateless, But I think it was a conscious choice.
So did you worry about whether readers liked Layla? I mean, I know you had what you wanted to say in there and wanted to show, but from a writer's perspective,
right. So I have Layla, and I have her best friend who is a lot more bold than Layla is, and I wanted to choose which one wants to be my main character. And even though I personally like her friend best because she's a lot more interesting and braver, I just thought she would be too larger than life, and it's better if Layla tells her story than she tells her own story. So I agree with Rufi. It's really more about how interesting characters are. Sometimes the most despicable characters in novels are the ones that stay with you when you finish reading the novel. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I think we touched on this before too. When people finish reading your work, what is it that you hope that they take away with them?
Me?
Yeah. Well, let's go around. Who? Ivy, Rufi, anybody want to jump in here on what you hope that people take away, or either a feeling, esoteric, or a message, or what you hope that they leave with?
I mean, I want them to take away a lot of different things. And I think that there's not one, in just the same way that some people find characters likable. And I think the question of likability in characters should be put to bed, because the world isn't about likable and unlikable. And I'm always so annoyed, well, these people are so unlikable. I'm like, but do you understand why they are the way they are? That's the most important thing. It's like, are they relatable? Not like, can you relate to them and dig it? But do you understand why that person does drugs? Do you understand why that person kills other people? Do you understand why he's so angry and at the world? And has the writer, done his or her job in making this person's behavior relatable, understandable to you? And then the issue of likability goes out the window. We only read books about people we liked, you'd only, as Ava said, you'd only be reading about people who look like you in your own comfort zone, and then the world would just be this tiny closed circle more than it is. But so if everyone should take something different away from my book and everybody else's book, depending on where you're coming from, because certain people are really excited to see people like themselves reflected in my work, to say oh my gosh, I've never ever, when I wrote Visitation Street, I grew up in Brooklyn. The majority of the bodega owners in the neighborhood I lived in were Lebanese. And so the guy who owned the bodega across from me, I saw him every day. I talked to him, and I made him a character in the book, and I gave him a copy of the book, and he was so thrilled to see, himself in the book. So he has a totally different reaction to somebody who's like, oh wow, it was great to see a waterfront community in Red Hook. But overall, if I had to say one thing I want everyone to take away from my work, is that we are all so lucky to be where we are, because I think we are all 1 or 2 minutes away from tragedy and violence, no matter what. We are all so lucky we haven't had when I write, it just seems so easy to have bad things happen. And I feel like I'm so blessed that hasn't happened to me, touch wood. And I feel like I want people to see that everyone is capable of making a mistake or wading into disaster, and that we should give everyone the chance for redemption to overcome that moment, because we are all so lucky that we haven't either been the victim of something like that or the perpetrator of it. And I think it's a really important lesson to learn and a way to think about living.
Okay, great. Rufi, how you?
So I always try to write about things that I don't have a conviction about, questions that I don't have an answer for and feel myself personally troubled by. And then I try to give different lines of argumentation about it to the different characters and sort of let them duke it out in the book. And so I don't think that there is an overarching message really, but what I hope is problematized by the end of the book, I feel like it sort of just opens up space, seeing all the lines of reasoning and all the conflicting moments. Because in one moment you're like, oh, this character's right about this. And then in another moment you're like, they can't be right because this character's right. And so what I want to do is just make more space so that we can really see. There's a lot of double think that we do about violence. The way we think about violence when it's in the newspaper versus the way that we think about violence in our own lives. We do a lot of weird double thinking about sex. And so I wanted to just try and make space. And all my books are really obsessed with this idea of being a good person and also how to love people that have done bad things. And that's, I guess, one of the things that for me, I knew that I'd reached the end of the book when, you know, Michael kind of admits that his love for her is bigger than his ability to judge her, that it doesn't matter anymore if he thinks that she's good. He still is there with her and loves her. And so I hope that that is what a reader would take away, I guess.
Okay, Ava, to you.
So we live in this world when there is a lot of us versus them, people versus on people. You know, there are only certain lives that we grieve when bad things, tragedies happen, and there are other lives that we don't grieve. And I was hoping that I could humanize the Kurds through this story so that numbers and facts turn into truth for people. So next time they watch on TV or read on a newspaper that, you know, Iran executed this many Kurds or Turkey killed this many Kurds, it wouldn't be like, Kurds what, who? They would be like, oh, I know, these are people, these are humans whose lives is worth living and protecting. And ideally, maybe they will write to their you know, representatives. They will demand from their senators and representatives that stop all these atrocities, like do something about it. And that could change something on a global level. But I think that first thing is to change that within our hearts, whether it is people who live in the society or are demonized because of drugs and prostitution, or they live on the other side of the planet. Because as someone who spent some 20 years in the eastern side and 20 years on the western side, I'm amazed by how much we emphasize our differences when we have so much in common. You know, why is it that so much attention goes to skin color and nationality and things like that, when we are 99.99% the same genes, and we feel the same things everywhere, and we deal with the same problems everywhere. So just to humanize the people who have been ignored and overlooked throughout the history.
Okay. Well, I think, you know, as I said, I don't want to take credit for the genius of this panel, which looks very diverse on the surface. But I think that the stories told are all connected through humanity and struggle and identity. You know, that identity and struggle carry through all three stories and three books. And I think that all the books are very important. And I hope that everybody who's listening will go out and purchase them and experience them for themselves. I think they got a good sense of it. But you can't really know until you experience it yourself. And I hope everyone will. So before I turn it over to questions for everybody else, which I think they're loading up there in the chat room, just really briefly, can you guys talk about what you're working on now and what's next for you? Ivy, you want to, since Ivy, you have that little tiny thing going on, you want to talk about that?
What's that?
Oh, the Netflix thing.
Oh, Hulu, it's on Hulu. I am actually not involved in the television side of these women, but it is being developed for TV by the creator of The Handmaid's Tale. But having a husband who works in TV, I know never to really hope for anything, because it's like, you know, it seems to be the least efficient, you know, media ever. It's like, why did they bother acquiring all these things? It's just beyond me. I'm like, when they say they're publishing your book, they publish your book. You know? You know, it's been a little hard to work. I have a 5-year-old who I had to homeschool or entertain for the last God knows how long, and
cook for.
What's that? Cook for. You can read all about that in New York Magazine if you want. I have been starting, you know, I am still besotted with this idea of violence. And I've been thinking a lot about why we idolize violent men, and like why Michael Mann movies, we find those guys super sexy when they're just beating the crap out of people. And how would you feel about women if they did that? You know, so I think that when we have violent women in fiction, they're always like they're always getting revenge on like husbands who beat them up, or like rapists, or, you know, not that those are things you shouldn't have revenge on, but like we can only justify a palette for female violence if it's for like some kind of retribution against their femininity and their, you know, female nature, or their mother, you know. And I'm just trying to think of a way to explore that with characters, you know, to have, whether it would be possible to have truly violent women in a book and make them, you know, as we say, palatable or likable. So I have no idea how that's going to happen, but we're going to see.
Good luck on that.
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
And meaningful too.
Okay, how about you, Rufi?
I also having the, oh my God, how am I ever going to write again with my kids home indefinitely situation. But I am feeling like a pressing psychological urge to start writing again. Like the story is coming to me in bits and pieces as I'm, you know, doing dishes, and I can tell I always turn a little bit into a zombie where I don't notice when people have been talking to me and I'm like, sorry, what? Because I was thinking, you know, you get obsessed with it. So what I want to work on in the next book, I'm really like, I'm sort of torn in 2 different directions, but I want to talk more about community. Like I want like a broader palette of like, I want to do something about mom friends. And my original idea also involved, you know, spaceships and time travel and stuff. So it's sort of like mommy set plus, you know, time travel. But I'm not sure, I'm just not positive that I'm going to go all the way down that road, but it's really fun doing all the reading for it. And so that's kind of where I am now, is just like endlessly buying books and staring off into space.
So I love the concept. Let us know how you do. I can't think of anything else like that. So good luck with that. Okay, how about you, Ava?
Yeah, it's been really difficult to be creative in this time, but I'm also writing a novel about the life of a refugee in the US who looks blonde, so she could pass for Caucasian if she wanted to. And so it's explored the question of identity and building your life from the scratch in a new place where your home is turned into hell, and now you have to find your voice and your place again. It's so far, I mean, the character is developing in my head. I haven't actually put much on the paper, but I like how it's going. Walking definitely helps a lot.
Well, that's good. That's a good prescription for everyone, I think. Carol, I'm gonna end my part of this and turn the questions over to Carol, who's been monitoring the chat room for us. So I want to thank you guys. I'll talk to you soon. Okay, go ahead, Carol.
Hi there. This has been really fascinating to hear the various perspectives on these books. And I really love the idea that Maddie brought about, that the books all bring the humanity and the identity of the characters. And it plays so beautifully in what's happening at this particular time. One of the questions that came up with, they wanted to know if the authors write with confident characters from different cultures. And I think maybe Ava, that might be, let's start with you and your answer on that.
I'm sorry, the question is, do we write with confidence about characters
from different cultures.
background? Okay, so I have two answers to that. One is from a person who comes from an underrepresented group, and what it feels like to see myself in other books written by non-Kurds.
Mm-hmm.
There is usually a sense of joy and pride that, okay, now I don't have the tools currently, I don't have a voice. How wonderful that someone is talking about us, is writing about us. But it could go both ways. I also do a lot of sensitivity reading for people who set their novels in the Middle East. And it's a really tricky business. On one hand, I think a novelist is a novelist when you can imagine being someone other than who you are. Otherwise, you're not really a novelist. On the other hand, it's so tricky, the business of ethnocentrism. If you can write about people from their own perspective, fantastic. But what happens often is that people are measured against a culture that's taken as the standard. So like Kurds are denied the right to just be and be themselves. Instead, they're constantly measured against a completely different culture. And there's a sense of judgment and looking down upon them. And then sometimes writers forget that people, regardless of where they are just, all of them are silly and nuanced and funny and complicated and idiotic and all of those things, that regardless of where we are, we're humans. We might have different ways of expressing it. So I have written about Iranian women and about Kurdish women so far. Doesn't mean I haven't had to explore. I sure had to, because I have written from different perspectives. I think authors and novelists especially have all the permission in the world to explore other cultures, for sure, if done rightly.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Rufi? You may not have the cultural thing, but you certainly have the variety of characters from different backgrounds.
And people have asked a lot of this question for me, since I'm writing from the point of view of a young gay man, and did I have the right to do that? And I've thought a lot about it. I think that when I was growing up reading like great literature, so much of literature is about women and about what it's like to be a woman, from, you know, Anna Karenina to Lady Chatterley's Lover to, and so I always assumed that you grew up reading, watching men write women, and you have these relationships with these fake women that men made, and you feel connected and bonded to these fake women. And so as at the beginning of my writing career, it was so antithetical, the idea that I wasn't allowed to identity walk in that way, the idea that I couldn't write a man, for instance, seemed like, nonsensical. I thought that's what the whole endeavor was. And so I think that it's about, I try to only write about things that I deeply know and that I can bring the full like humanity to. And I loved what Ava said about like the silly and idiotic and all those things. And I think as long as you stay with, I think that's why they say write what you know, because if you write about something you don't know, all you have to start with is the stereotype. And so there's a greater danger that you won't be able to bring out that full humanness. But I think that that's the point of the whole endeavor, is to, play around with all these masks. At the end of the day, my book is only going to have my point of view in it. I can only write from my own life experience. You will get to know me better. It will never be about getting to know a young gay man. It will always be me in the mask. And so I think that that play of masks is still like sacred and vital and important. It's not like anthropological, I guess. So I go softly and thoughtfully, but also with urgency, I guess.
Yeah. And it's about the two characters, Bunny and Michael, really striving to make a connection within their sphere and even between each other.
Yeah. I think that a lot of that book is about not being seen, and those two see each other and sort of rehumanize each other. High school is such a terrible time because everybody is, you know, faking it, and yet everyone is sort of a merciless critic, and so that is sort of what they have in common, is they can take off their masks with each other and be themselves.
How about you, Ivy?
I think I sort of answered this question earlier about, you know, my book is told from the perspective of 6 different women, not all of whom are identical to me. But I think the person who posed the question used the word confidence or confidently, and I'm not exactly sure how that was implied, but, you know, to be a novelist is to write with confidence. You know, you can't be half-hearted about any of your characters, and even the minor ones, and even the ones who you might have created to be dislikable. So, you know, to do it ultimately is to do it with confidence and a little bit of arrogance, I'd say too, but, you know, that's what gets me up in the morning, you know, the idea that someone's going to read this. But I think the confidence when you are approaching a character who might be other than you, of course, should be tempered with, you know, caution, but also you need to, if you do it confidently, it means you bring the level of understanding that is necessary. Not overconfidence, you know, not brashness, but, you know, and if you are thorough and, you know, imaginative, you know, your characters will come to life. Also, you know, in a weird way, it's sort of the question of imposing. It's not just thinking about someone who's not like you, but it's like how you would be in that, you know, in that situation. So I can't imagine really outside my own experience, in the sense that if I'm writing from someone else's perspective, I have to sort of create a sense of how I would be if it turned out that I had to be an exotic dancer. You know, how would I be if I, you know, lost a child, or if, you know, how would I be if I was, you know, whatever it is. So you know, it's a combination of imagination and, you know, the guts to do it brings out confident characters, I guess.
Who are some of the writers that inspire you? Who wants to go first? How about you, Rufi? Are you inspired by any writer in particular?
Oh, well, there's so many writers that I deeply admire. I love, and there's also, who are the writers that I read with my readerly sense versus who are the writers who, reading them as I was growing into a person, influenced me the most, whether I wanted them to or not. And so in terms of writers that I just really admire, I would say Jane Smiley is up there at the top of the list, Elizabeth Strout, Karen Joy Fowler, Ruth Ozeki, but also Ann Patchett. I love Kevin Wilson. But I also think that I was just hugely influenced by John Irving and his sense of philosophical curiosity and just like comedic sensibility. Like there's how do you write such a funny book about abortion? Like you go to pitch that book and you're like, it's going to be a comedy set in an orphanage about abortion. And somehow it's so funny that I was like crying at points. And I think that that's what moves me as a writer, is how horrible life is and how very, very funny. And so I know I got a lot of that from reading John Irving.
Okay. How about you, Ava?
I read a lot of Iranian and Kurdish writers when I was a kid, and later when I entered the world of English literature, the first people that I was introduced to were the classic authors like Emily Dickinson, Ernest Hemingway, people that I really loved. Nowadays, I read a lot. I'm just a book addict. I really love to support debut authors, so I like to read what's out there, and it's a fresh blood. And I can tell you about what I've read recently that I really loved. I loved Remembrance by Rita Woods. That's about slavery. I really love Ta-Nehisi Coates, all of his books. Of debut authors, I love Douglas, what's his name? Shaggy Bane, the guy who wrote Shaggy Bane, Douglas Stewart. Michael Zapata, who wrote the book of Adana, the last book of Adana Maru. So I have also learned a lot of my craft through really studying novels that I love and not just reading them. There's always a difference between what you read to see what the author has done that created this masterpiece. And I think authors like Zadie Smith or Richard Flanagan's are authors that I go back to see how they created these really powerful scenes and dialogues and characters.
And Ivy?
I have a few authors who I completely idolize, one of whom is Dennis Johnson. I just love him. He's a poet and a novelist. Oh, he was, I guess, sadly. In terms of my, I always go back and reread his books. I love Don Carpenter, who wrote Hard Rain Falling. But in These Women, a book that was really, really seminal was Zadie Smith's N.W., which I just think is one of the best books ever written. The way it's so good. I mean, if I could have, like, they always ask you if there's one book you could have written, what would it be? And I think N.W., because it's 4 different books and the creativity and the voices there is just absolutely astonishing. I love James Mcbride. I just read Deacon King Kong. I'm late to that party. And I have to say, I have never been so transported and blown away by anything in a very long time. It's actually exactly something that Ava said, which is he's writing about, I actually wrote a book set in the exact same place as he did, in the projects in Brooklyn and the Red Hook. He grew up there. And he's writing about people in very difficult situations and the humor and the liveliness and just the humanity and joy. And it's not so great what's going on. It's just so impressive. I love that. I do love Don DeLillo and Jonathan Lethem. Their books have been really influential on me. And of course, I got to give a shout out to some of my friends in the mystery category, because it is really important to read genre fiction because that's where all the best plots are. And genre fiction is too often dismissed for just being throwaway, but the characters in Attica Locke's book and the plot and the politics should be essential reading. So Attica Locke is really, really important, as well as a bunch of the other women writing in crime fiction. But that's who I've been turning to recently.
And I'll start with you again, Ivy. What are some of your writing practices? Like, what's your writing day like?
Well,
maybe under regular circumstances, not so much under the quarantine.
I have a daughter, as I mentioned, who has to go to school, it turns out. So it's all changed since she started going to school. I drive her to school. And then if the world could be, my oyster, I would write from like 9 to 2, and then go do whatever I wanted. I used to have a job. For many years, I had a job that started at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. So I'd work in the morning and then go to work. Did that for 5 years. So I'm really used to that. But now I drop Loretta off at school, and then I come home and I try to work. And, if I'm home by 11, if I've gone and done errands or gone to the gym, I work from 11 to 3. I mean, it's not great, but if it's after 2 o'clock, there's no point. If it's after 1 o'clock, I don't even bother sitting down at the computer. I'm such a baby. I work at home at my desk. I do not work in a coffee shop. I do not work, on the airplane. It's at home or nothing. It's
on a computer?
Probably the worst. I know it's like the worst habit, but I'm a real baby about it. I designed my entire life to be able to work from home. Apparently I got my wish recently.
And are you on a computer, or are you doing it longhand on a pad?
No, I take notes with one hand and sort of type with 2 hands. So because my brain races ahead. So I got my wish. I'm at home, but I'm not working. Actually, I'm not at home, but I'm visiting my in-laws, but I'm not working.
How about you, Rufi? What's your writing practice?
Well, I also I dislike writing in public because I make a lot of faces and say the dialogue out loud and stuff, and it's very embarrassing. I don't like for anyone to even be home. I can do it if there are multiple doors in between me and the other person, but I would prefer to have the whole house to myself. I think it's really important to have 1 cup of coffee that you microwave like 600 times so that it develops that sort of gummy film on the top. That's really important. I do a lot of, like I identified when Ava said that she writes just a ton of sort of exploratory material. I would say that I spend like a solid year thinking about a book before I even try to start writing it. And so I rely heavily on note cards. I love note cards. I write ideas for scenes. I write single lines. I write an idea for a title, an idea for a whole other book. And then I obsessively sort them in little piles with binder clips. And if you do that for like an hour, you feel like you've worked, and you can then go about the rest of your day. All this changes when I'm actually like in writing something actively. And then it's like, all I do is sit down and then like write, and then sort of wake up and go get the kids from school.
How about you, Ava?
I have to steal time to write because I've always worked full time, sometimes 60, 70, even 80 hours a week. So I take a notebook with me, a small one. It could be when I am, taking a walk after lunch, or you used to be in subway in Toronto all the time to work. It could be if I'm really truly inspired, I have something I want to write that I'm excited about, I have to get up early at 5:30 or 6, or go to sit somewhere outside after work to write, just because I know if I go home, I go to this resting mode and I won't be able to write. So sometimes I force myself to go to a library or somewhere and sit down, write for a couple hours. So for me, it's really every day figuring out how exactly can I steal some time to write. Unfortunately, I don't have a schedule right now, but I look forward to the day when I will be able to say, I'm going to write from this time to this time. Hopefully that will happen.
I know there are authors sometimes that will say they get to their computer and it's blank. So when I ask them, well, what do you do when that happens? A lot of them have said that they just write. No matter what it is, whether it's something totally nonsensical, whether it's just the alphabet, they just write until something starts to happen. Have any of you ever experienced anything like that? How about you,
Yeah,
Abby?
and then I do everything but write. It's like there's a whole internet out there to hang out with. Like, it's it's such a weird thing, the idea that it's blank, because if you're in the middle of the book, there's always something to work on. I know it's such a horrible and pretentious thing to say, but I don't actually believe in writer's block, because like sometimes you're stuck in the story and you don't know where it's going, but there's always something to do, and I feel like the answer is often in there in something you've already written. A whole section of my book, one section of my book is written from the first person, the rest of the book's in the third person. And I was sort of just messing around because I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to write a detective character or not. I really didn't. And then I started hearing this woman's voice and I was like, well, I'll do this today. And then it turned into this thing that links the whole book together. So I really think that like the tyranny of the blank page is something that's been enforced upon people asking questions of writers. Like I feel like it's like a question. I've never heard two writers talk about it. So I was like, what's writer's block? I'm like, other people have invented it for us because they want to understand.
Has that ever happened for you, Ava?
Well, if I can't write, then I'm definitely going to do something else. I'm a big fan of the ocean. That's why I moved to California. So if I go paddle for an hour, swim, surf, do something, then I do have the idea. But usually I think for me, it's where I'm too stressed. That's why I cannot create. So if I go get rid of the stress somehow, then I come back and I have the idea. So if I don't have something to write, I don't force myself to write, basically.
Yeah. I very, very much exactly what both of them said. I think that there's not knowing how the scene, you haven't done your thinking. So you go to write and you realize that you don't know what you're writing yet. And so then you do the ideation activities, and going to the ocean is one. For me, it's always taking a long walk. There's something about walking and you're thinking and it just like loosens everything. But I think that there's like two other specific tricks for those writers out there. One is always stop in like the middle of a scene so that you have something to start with when you come back, or like don't let yourself write all the way to the end of everything that you pictured. Like stay still dying to write the next part. I think that that helps. And then whenever I'm truly stuck and I don't know what comes next and I just feel really stupid, that is when I do go to the library and I go there, like it's church, and I just like somehow I feel like all those books make me smarter. Like they seep energetically into me and I call upon their strength, and then I always just have better ideas. So go to the library.
And I'll just ask this last question and I'll turn it back over to Maddie. Do you ever find that the characters drive you, or do you drive the characters? Because I hear of writers sometimes that say, oh, the character is telling me it wants to go in this direction and somebody else wants to go in this direction. And, you know, so how does that work for you?
You know, the characters are going to tell their own story. Like I create them, and obviously, but you know, I always had this idea. Well, when I was first writing, I have a early novel that isn't discussed too often, and you know, I really wanted the characters to have a happy ending, and then just like the journey I followed them on, that just wasn't going to happen. So the characters, I create them, but I have to follow them, because like even if I've set out, you know, some idea of where I think they should go, in the course of getting to know them better, I start to understand their behaviors and their, you know, responses. And sometimes the ending that I have in mind is often not the ending that can, you know, that is plausible or believable, or, you know, I hate this word, earned. You know, like if you want to have a happy ending or whatever, your characters better earn it by their behavior. And like my characters often don't behave properly, or, you know, or put themselves in weird situations. So yeah, I really hope that you know, you follow your characters, you don't lead them.
Okay. Ava?
Well, I guess in the beginning, it's a struggle to get to know them, to see who they are. And once they're fully formed, yes, then you have to follow them. You can't just impose something them because your mood is different today. They have already been created and have their own personalities. And so they might refuse things you want to impose on them. But it takes a while before the characters are so live in your head that they can say no to you. And that's a joy when your character is so fully formed that, you know, they have their own mind. That's a fantastic stage in writing, really.
Mm-hmm. So do you, on cards, for instance, write all the characteristics that you want the character to have, and
no,
then put that on?
No, I start writing, I start thinking about, okay, this is crazy, but I'm going to confess. I start thinking about how their parents felt when my character was conceived. That's how I start. And then think about, what was the first time they broke a bone? What was it like when they first fell in love? What was it like when they got their first rejection or their first excitement? And then just try to get to know them. And I did just write, not in notes, in full sentences, just to understand them. I will end up using very small portions of those at the end. But one of the things I like to tell my students in my creative writing workshops is I ask them to write a very small scene about a character crossing the street and going to get coffee. I ask them to write it about a stranger doing that. And then I asked them to write the same scene, simple act of buying a coffee, but write it as if their best friend or their mom is doing that, and understand the difference. So once we know the characters really well, it just changes how you write them. So for me, I might write, 10,000 words just to fully form a character and ask a lot of questions about who they are, who they like to be, things like that. How do they see the world? What's their religion? What's their political perspective? A lot of those things.
Okay. And Rufi?
I think that there's sort of two things that are related. One is sometimes you start out a book and then thinking that the characters will do one thing, but then as you develop them and they become these sort of more realistic people, you realize that your plan for them is not what they will actually do. And so then you have to make a new plan. And so there's that way in which your characters like won't do what you want them to do. But I also think that when you're actually writing, because you are visualizing and almost half dreaming, sometimes the characters just do something that surprises you. You're making like 1,000 decisions a second about what's happening. And so you can't be conscious about every decision that you make. Sorry, is it okay? And so I think that I definitely sometimes will be like, after I've written something, and be like, I wonder why I keep, like, sometimes another character will enter and you think, well, did I have that happen because I didn't know what came next in the conversation? Or do I want this character in the room? And so there is some sort of interplay with a subconscious part of yourself that can be surprising, I think.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for taking on those extra questions. Maddie, would you like to just share a little bit about LitUP OC?
Just very quickly, it's a writer's salon in Orange County. We showcase the work of local authors, published and unpublished, fiction and nonfiction, all genres. So it's an interesting, I like to call it like an amped up writer's salon, or maybe a writer's salon on steroids. I hope everybody, we meet once a month during the pandemic. We are live streaming on Facebook, which has expanded our audience. We now have an audience of over 1,000. So we've gone from, being very happy in a little coffee shop in Tustin to making the best of the pandemic and expanding our reach and helping to promote our authors. So I'm excited about that. And just really briefly, I have to say quickly to Ivy, my little one said, I have to say hi to you. And she's to let you know that she's on page 261 of Epic.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
And when she finishes this, she's going to read Harry Potter. So
Oh my God.
how that goes, where you are in the order.
Oh, but not of my book. Of
no. She's going to finish your book, and then she's got Harry Potter in the queue. But she wanted to read yours first.
Wow.
Which one is that, Maddie, that she's reading?
Ivy's book that she wrote.
These women?
Yeah, Epica?
Epica?
Oh, yeah, the children's book. Okay, yes, I also wrote the
Okay,
children's
well, that just brings up another thing too. That just brings up another thing,
These
because
women, and she's enjoying it.
one with a co-writer. So would you like to talk a little bit about that one?
Briefly.
Yes.
Oh, me?
We have just a few minutes.
So I am I'm the writer and the co-creator of the Epica series with Kobe Bryant. Unfortunately, we are not going to continue after book 2. I just finished book 2 today or yesterday and submitted it. They're a great series of young adult books featuring such a wide range of characters and athletes who are sort of underrepresented in middle grade fiction. It's really been one of the best experiences and also one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my life to get to do this. But hopefully his stories will live on with the people he wanted to, inspire the most, which is kids. So I'm glad to be a major part of that.
You are awesome. Going ahead and contributing to her reading enjoyment. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. Yeah.
That's great.
All right,
well, I'm going to ask one more question based on what you just said, Ivy. Ava or Rufi, have either of you thought about collaborating with another author on a book the way that Ivy did? Ava, sorry.
I haven't so far explored that option. It shouldn't be an easy thing to do. I don't know how you can have 2 different visions, but it must be interesting to explore. I've done collaborations in other aspects other than creative writing, and there's always joy in having 2 brains work together. But I think about literature as such a subjective thing. I don't know how you can collaborate, but I'm open to exploring the option if it ever comes up.
And Ivy will be able to give you some guidance in that direction, I think. How about you, Rufi?
I have not really. I mean, I have like a joke with my sister-in-law that we're going to write a mystery series together. But mainly just because she obsessively watches like Cold Case Files and Snapped, and she majored in criminology. And so it would be very fun. But I do have fantasies about writing on a TV show. I think getting to do that breaking down of like a story and figuring out the pieces, it must just go so much faster with multiple people involved. And to have the opportunity, someone else's impulses for how a story should go are just going to be different. And so it's something I would love to experience, but maybe not with a novel. It seems much harder to do with something the length of a novel.
Well, thank you so much. Before we close, I want to remind you that on the website of www.museo.org will be the links for LitUP OC and also for you authors. This has been really a wonderful afternoon. So thank you, Ivy, Rufi, and Ava, for sharing your talents with us this afternoon. If any of you watching would like more information, please have a look at our website. Let us know your thoughts on this program as well. We want to make sure that we're continuing to provide relevant programs during this particularly challenging time. To support the Museo, there's also a donate button. We welcome any support in any amounts to help us continue our mission to engage the community with relevant programs like this one. And thank you so much, Maddie. We appreciate you being on our program today. And thank you, Ava, Ivy, and Rufi, for enlightening us on this presentation. Special thank you to the folks in the back, Berkenda, for your work on all the technical, and to you, our viewing audience, taking the time this afternoon to spend with us. Stay well, stay safe, stay healthy. Until the next time. Thank you so much.